Mark Redmond wants to know, how do I remove the lower cowl if the latches don't retract when the lever is raised? Mark, this is a really good question. Thank you for commenting and subscribing. That is going to really depend on what model of engine you have. Now, when you say lower cowl, I'm not sure if you're talking about the lower cowlings or the top cowling, but if the only thing that I could think of is that you mean like the cowling itself, because that's the only thing that's going to have latches. Everything else, like the lower cowling and all that stuff, that's all going to come apart only if you have the top cowl off. If you don't have the top cowl off, then the lower is not going to come off. And the lowers, I'm trying to think of any model that has lower cowls that are held on by a latch. All of them are screwed on together. They're two pieces. They go around the drive shaft housing and they screw together. So I'm assuming that you're talking about the top cowl, even though you said the lower cowl, unless this is a Verado and you're talking about the rear cowl. So based on that, that's what I'm going to give you an information based on each type of those different situations. If you're talking about the rear cowl on an L6 Verado, there are two latch cables that go around and hook it in the back like this. So like whenever you take the top cowling off, you take that off. There's then a handle, you flip that handle up, and there's two latches that are holding the back cowl on that, comes off the back like that. Those two latches are stuck. A lot of times you can grab the cowling in the back on the bottom and the top and pull on the bottom. Those latches are stuck on cables and they're corroded and the cables are not letting go. And sometimes you can just yank on the bottom of it and get those to pop free, and then that'll get the cowling off. If that doesn't work, then you need to get a long screwdriver that you can stick down in there, or a long pry bar or something that you can put down on that latch that's hooked like this. You'll put it on that latch and then you'll hit it with a hammer and knock that latch back. Once it goes back, then the cowling is going to come off. Now, if you're talking about any other engine, like say a Yamaha or like a Merc V8 or V6 or something like that, where the cowling is actually stuck, very common on Yamaha 3.3 liters or Yamaha HPDIs, where the handles would not, they would get stuck there, or the housings themselves would get corroded and you couldn't unlatch them to get the cowling to come off. So based on the model that you have is going to be based on how you're going to get that latch off. If it's like an HPDI, they're kind of easier because the handles flip out like this, and then some of the 3.3s as well. Those handles, you can pry on them. The main thing is that you're going to break something. Like no matter what it is, no matter the model, no matter the engine, you're going to end up breaking something in order to get that cowling off. And if it is like a 3.3 or an HPDI, something like that, Yamaha 3.3 liter 4-stroke, like 200, 225, 250, any of those, the latches on the cowlings have like housings that sit down like this, and there's a little latch that sits in that cowling that rotates when you move the handle in and out. So what you got to do is basically take a screwdriver or something, stick it up in there behind the handle, and you're going to hit it with a hammer until that housing busts open. Once that housing busts open, the housing is what actually holds the handle together. So once that housing busts open, then the handle's just going to be flopping around there. You can move it out of the way, get your cowling off. Now, there are other models that doesn't work. Some of the ones that come out like this, and then also like a Merc V8 or V6, the new style that has the cowling latches. I mean, not really new. It's like 8 years old. But some of those you will have to drill a hole in the cowling. So based on the model, there'll be a certain dimension that you have to drill, and you'll have to measure up on the cowling, measure over, and you'll have to drill a hole in the cowling, and then you'll be able to get to that latch, to that cable. Like the V8s, you drill through the cowling, and I want to say there's a little like a cable thing that you can turn, and it's going to release that latch. And then on like the Yamahas, it's similar thing where you're drilling a hole in it and you're drilling through to where that cable, you can knock the cable out of the way, or unhook it, whatever it may be, depending on the model, to get the cowling latch to actually unhook from mounting it down. That should hopefully answer your question. That's a really good question because it does happen, especially on older engines. People in freshwater probably never going to have to deal with that, but as far as anybody in the saltwater, not very uncommon to see something like that on like a 20, 25-year-old engine that's been sitting for 5, 10 years and has not had the cowling come off. M. Carrera says he has a Yamaha F200, gets stuck, and even at full throttle, it refuses to rev up past a certain RPM. The fuel consumption rises a lot, but the boat is bogged, even struggling to get past 12 knots. No misfiring or any apparent issues. Any ideas? So if we're talking about an F200, it's either going to be the V6 or the V8. Won't go past a certain RPM. Is bogged down. No misfiring. I'm not sure about that. I'm going to say that it's most likely misfiring it and you're just not realizing it. But you basically have two options. One, it's not getting fuel or the delivery's off. Or two, you're in an RPM reduction. Or actually three, basically probably closer to one of those two, that you're either in an RPM reduction where it's limited or you don't have fuel. I guess if you didn't have spark plugs or you got a problem with your spark plugs or something like that, but usually if you've got, an ignition problem, it's not going to just bog down. Bogging down is more like a fuel issue. Now, the reason I say a rev limiter is that the fuel consumption is rising. You're saying the fuel consumption rises. So if you had a fuel issue, your fuel consumption wouldn't really rise. But if you're saying you put the handle all the way down, the boat just bogs out and won't get on plane, won't go past 12 knots, and your fuel consumption goes up a lot, most likely the engine is in a Guardian or RPM reduction is what it is. So whether a trim sensor is messed up and it thinks the engine's trimmed up, or a temp sensor is messed up and it thinks you're overheating, but really you should have some kind of an audible alarm if that be the case. Which would mean that, if you put the handle all the way down, the computer is going to be trying to get the TPS and the air and all the other stuff. It's going to throw your timing up to where it's supposed to be. And if you're in the rev limiter, it's just going to cut your spark or whatever, which is going to, kill the cylinder. You're going to have a misfire, but your fuel consumption is going to rise because it's still dumping all that fuel, but it's limiting you to that RPM. So those are my only ideas based on, I'm not sure if you're talking about the V6. Is it a 2.8 liter? I would say that most likely you do have a misfire though. But somewhere along the lines, I would start with that. I would start by checking the fuel and then also making sure that you don't have, any codes or something like that. You should basically have an alarm if something like that's going on. Fantasy says, hello and congratulations on your videos. Thank you, Fantasy. Really well done. I would like to know if the 3 piston seals are identical for all three. Thanks. Talking about a trim unit. This has been actually a pretty common question. I think I've seen this 2 or 3 times. No, they are not. Your 2 trim ram seals are going to be the same, but the tilt ram seal is going to be different. Doesn't matter if it's Suzuki, Honda, Mercury, Yamaha, Daihatsu. Doesn't matter. I can't think of any brand, any trim unit that has the same tilt seals as the same trim ram seals. So, no, they're not different. Your 2 trims are going to be the same, but the tilt is going to be different. Again, anybody that can think of one that has the same, let me know in the comments. But as far as I can think of, I can't think of off the top of my head any trim unit that has the same trim and tilt ram seals. 5.7 Tundra says, just lost my one and only key for my 05 Suzuki Outboard. Is it true there is only a set amount of key numbers made? Would the ignition switch have a number on it? Yes. Unfortunately, you lost the key, but yeah, they should have a number on it. If you take the key switch out and twist the thing off of it, there should be a number on that key. I can't remember 100% if Suzuki has the numbers on the key, but I'm pretty sure they do. It'll be on a flat spot. All you do is on the front, you take your key out of the ignition switch. There'll be a bezel on there. Spin that bezel out, and you'll be able to pull the key back. And when you pull it back, there's a flat spot on the key, and usually there's a number stamped on there. Most of the time, that'll give you a key number, and then you just order that specific key number. So take key switch out and check it. I'm 100% sure on Yamahas and Mercuries that they do, but I can't remember 100% if the Suzukis have it on that flat spot or not. I think they do. Motor V8 says, another top-notch video, brother. Thank you, Motor V8. Got a 2004 Yamaha F90 with 350 hours freshwater use, but in a real dark lake with lots of sediment. Think it might be time for a flush like this. By the way, what's the lifespan of thermostats on these motors? So talking about doing ridline flush and, flushing everything out on an F90 2004 using a dark lake with a lot of sediment, it's probably not going to hurt. What I would do is I would take the thermostat out and look inside there. If you take the thermostat out, take a look inside there, see what it kind of looks like. If it looks like you got a lot of buildup, then I would, go for the ridline. If it doesn't look like there's that much, sediment in there, even because it is a freshwater, it is dark sediment, but, I'm not sure if, it's really brackish or whatnot. But I would say take the thermostat out, look inside there, and that's going to give you a really good indication of what everything looks like on the inside of the engine. Being an F90, not a huge engine, and 350 hours is not a lot of time either. So, we're talking 20 years, 350, that's barely 20 some hours a year. Yeah, that's not even. That's 17 and a half hours a year. So you're putting less than 20 hours a year on the engine. So I would say that most likely you might not need a flush like that. Now, as far as the lifespan on a thermostat, that is very hard to tell. Usually, they say 3 years or 300 hours on a thermostat. Because a thermostat is, it's in the cooling system, so it's always getting that water going through it. So, corrosion is an issue, and it just in general, the water is going to break down the materials that the thermostat is made out of, and it's going to start to rust the metal. A thermostat has a spring on it, so, it kind of... they can degrade, and then they might not open up or close at the right temperatures. So as far as, the lifespan, it's like hit or miss. If the thermostat, you putting on 20 hours a year, in 3 years, the thermostat might look like it's brand new because it has not, you don't have any use on it. So it might go for quite a while after, but at the same time, given the age with the water, it's kind of a look at it and see if it works or not. And then also what you would do is you just take the thermostat out, put it in a cup of water. You heat up the water to whatever degree the thermostat's supposed to open up. If it opens up at that temperature and then closes below that temperature, then, the thermostat's still good. So kind of hit or miss there. If it's in salt water, just change it, because most likely it's going to be degrading and corroding. But since you're in freshwater, you might be able to get more lifespan out of your thermostats. That kind of stuff, really, it's a service item. So it's just like spark plugs, fuel filters, oil filters, thermostats, impellers, all that stuff is a maintenance item. So, the lifespan is kind of based on the use and the age as well. So, the age will also deteriorate the component. So, I can't really give you a number and say, change it. There's people up in the middle of Wisconsin that have been running the same thermostat for 15 years. So, giving you an actual time stamp for a maintenance item, kind of hard to do. Jake Caposa, I don't know, maybe let's say your name's Jake. Have you done this same service on year 89 to 95, 60 to 90 horsepower Mercuries? Is it possible to remove tilt ram same way as you did with this Yamaha without removing the whole unit off the motor? So, yeah, by in general, obviously in 89 to 95, I can't get too specific on models, but by and large, you can service any trim unit while it's on the boat. There are some units that you can't, but those are kind of like which models you can and which models you can't. There's no way that I'm going to be able to remember each and every one, but I would definitely say that you just try it. For one, the trim rams, you'll always be able to service those on the boat. Those come off. But there are select few models that you can't get the tilt rod out. But with it disconnected, most of them, by and large, you can pick up the engine, bring it down, and get that ram out. So I would say yes, and you'll know whenever you do it. There are some units that you cannot, though. I want to say there's an Optimax that we had to take the bracket off in order to get the ram out because of the way the bracket is. But by and large, the vast majority of them, you can get the tilt rod out of the unit without having to pull the entire unit. So you're just going to have to take the cap off and then disconnect it and try and get it out of there. I'm going to say you probably will be able to, but that's an 89, 95. I'm not really that well versed in something that old. I don't have an extensive experience with late 80s, early 90s, those engines. Crystal says, hello, mister. I bought a brand new Mercury 150 EFI 4-stroke and it won't start. When I put the key on start, there is an electric click sound and the starter does not work. You can hear the fuel pump, but that's it. Did you know what the problem is? The battery is also brand new, 100 amp hour, 850 amps. Thank you for giving your opinion. Answer. So, depends when we're talking about a starting unit. So if it clicks, then that that the control side is working and the relay is starting to go. But you are going to have to do some testing to figure this out. First thing that I would do is take a load tester, since you got a brand new battery, but there's so much stuff in between from your battery to the engine starter. There's a lot of components. You've got a battery switch. You've got, you got a cable from the battery to the battery switch with two ends on it that could be bad. You got a battery switch that could be bad. You got a wire that goes from the battery switch back to the engine that could be messed up. And then you have a wire that goes from, the stud where the battery cable connects on the engine up to the starter. On that 150, I think the battery cable comes in and goes straight to the starter, so you can forget about that last one. But either way, process is the same. You still got a lot of cables and the battery switch in between the starter and the battery. So what you need to do is get a load tester and hook it straight to the starter where your load cables, the big cables that are going, into the engine and hooking to the starter, clamp it to the starter and the ground, hit it with a load tester and see what happens. If you hit it with a load tester and that voltage drops to nothing, then your problem isn't your starter and it isn't your starting system per se as of right now. You have a problem with getting power to the starter where, you might have a bad battery switch. You could have a wire that's busted. You could have a loose connection on the battery switch. So definitely always start with that before you go just condemning a starter. Because if you're turning the key, you go to start, fuel pump's running, so your PCM's up, and then you go to start and you just hear it clicking. The relay is clicking. That means it's telling that solenoid on the starter to open up and let that power hit the starter. But if nothing happens, you most likely don't have any power there at the starter, so that's why it's not going to do anything, because it doesn't have any power. The relay is just a control side that controls the larger cables, the high output or the high amp draw of, the starter. You've got a relay with small wires that control that system. So I would troubleshoot that first. Seeing it's a brand new engine, then most likely it doesn't have a bad starter right out the gate. Most likely you do not have, you got probably a loose connector on the back of the battery switch, or one of the battery cables is messed up, or the ground isn't hooked up all the way, something like that. Loose connection, that'd be my first thought, and most likely the issue when it comes to a starting issue on a brand new engine. Now, starters can be bad out the box, so there is that, but check to make sure you got power to run that starter before condemning anything else. PF Publius. There's a good chance my till and trim was in water. I'm concerned that I might find some corrosion inside the pistons. You mentioned that not a lot truly goes bad on these, but I'm curious, what would give you pause on the internals apart from what you mentioned about the rams being nicked? So again, we're talking about trim units and the inside. If you get water inside the unit, like I said, there's not a lot that goes bad in them. There are little balls inside of the trim unit with springs behind them. They are valves, basically. They're passageways. And if you have water inside the trim unit, then those can rust, because now you have these metal components. They're springs and little balls that are polished to fit in an orifice and block fluid to run in different directions based on how you're trying to operate the trim unit. So those would be my only concern. Other than that, flushing, getting all the water out of it and filling it up, that's kind of the basic concerns with a trim unit, is that, as long as you got no nicks on the rams, that's going to allow water in and fluid out. But if there was a lot of water in there, I would be checking those springs and stuff to make sure that none of them are rusted or, getting stuck. Because if those little balls get rusted, they can stick in place, which is going to make the unit not work properly. But, you have to take it all the way apart, clean everything, and make sure that there isn't anything rusty in there. If there's no rust on anything and everything looks good, then there's not, like I said, there's not a whole lot. Trim unit's just a hydraulic pump. So it's very, very basic. There's not a lot, fluid goes this way or fluid goes this way. That's that's kind of it. So yeah, it's a very simple system. Cameron Wenzel, what would be your recommendation to do a 300-hour 96 Saltwater Series 2? So we're talking about a 300-hour service, I'm guessing, or a 1996 Saltwater Series that has 300 hours on it. I picked up on a Hughes impeller and thermostats. Guy bought it from the second owner and didn't know the service info. Also ordered a paper manual to use. Screw online manuals. It's a 150. The oiler works, but they were still running premixed. On an OX66, I would be wanting to run the oil system that's on it. That's a really good system from Yamaha, probably one of the best out there for the two-stroke oiling system. It's very simple. I understand, we made that video. If you haven't seen it yet, check that out on how that system works. But the electrical side of it is the main concern. If like a sensor goes bad or a harness or something like that, the pump can fail on the remote oil tank. But by and large, if one of those components fails, sometimes they can get expensive, and that's why a lot of people will skip that and premix it. But on an OX66, I would try and use the oil system on the engine itself. Now, as far as the service goes, if it's new to you, for me, rule of thumb, by and large, when I buy something like that, unless I know 100% that everything got serviced, and depending on who did the service, I try and just do a service on the thing right then and there. That way, 100%, because you're buying it brand, to you, think about it like it's brand new to you, and you want to make everything set so that way you're ahead of the game. You want to change the lower unit oil, pressure test the gear case to make sure it doesn't have any leaks, as well as inspect the seals on the lower unit, change your oil filters, inspect your spark plugs, inspect the thermostat, check the anodes. I would just go through and do an inspect/replace, do a full 300-hour service on it just to make sure everything is good. Make sure it has the right spark plugs in it, the right thermostat, because you don't know, what someone else has done. So for me, when I get a new engine, I try and go through it, visual inspection, and then do a full service. So that way, 100% on this day, this many hours, boom, I'm starting from scratch. I know everything's done, and I know it's all done right. Everything is greased. Everything is, lubed down. You got CRC on the engine. Everything's clean, and it's you're starting basically from scratch. That's the way I look at it. That's what I would do. But, as far as necessities, to me, that's what I would do, because I want to know what's up with the engine before, before you go out and start thinking and using it for long trips and stuff. You want to be, make sure your reliability's on par. DJL says, if the computer shows you followed the break-in process and you still have the fuel dilution issue and you tried the Yamaha solution several times and still have the issue, have you seen Yamaha cover this issue under warranty? Is the customer responsible for this design flaw? So we're talking about engines that make oil, and it's not really a design flaw. I wouldn't say that. And also, as far as looking at the computer is not going to show you if it was broken properly. All a computer does is records runtime. So I think people think the computer's a little bit more advanced than it really is. Most of the computers, they're not going to show if you did a break-in period. What it does is as soon as the engine's running, it starts recording, and it records the time and the RPM. So if you're running at 1,000 RPMs, it's just going to be recording the amount of time that you're running at 1,000 RPM. If you run at 1,500, 2,000, 3,000, it's going to run that timer based on those RPM ranges. Most of them go from 750 to 1,000. Or, say it goes from 0 to 1,000, from 1,001 to 2,000, from 2,000 to 3,000, 3,001 to 4,000, 4,001 to 5,000. It breaks it down like that. And then it just shows you that exact thing right there. It'll get up to wide open throttle, and then it'll say, 6250 plus, meaning that you've gone above that. And then it just records that time. So whenever you pull that report and that rundown, all that shows you is that, the engine has been ran for 15 hours under 1,000 RPM, 20 hours between 1,000 and 2,000, 500 hours at 2,000 to 3,000. It's going to give you just a number and an RPM range. It doesn't show you anything about, whether or not it was broken properly or not, because break-in process is a little bit different than that. You're just varying the RPMs and getting the rings to seat. So, after the first 10 hours, after the first 100 hours, you're going to have no idea. No one's going to be able to see anything about how it was ran during the break-in process. So given that, no, there's not any way to show, how the engine was broke in. And it's not really a design flaw. It's just how an internal combustion engine works. It's how metal, it's just how it works. There's not really any way around it. You're talking about, piston rings, a compression ring, a combustion chamber, heat, and the cylinder walls. So it's this component wearing itself into place, and it doesn't matter if it's a car, doesn't matter if it's a lawnmower, doesn't matter if it's an outboard, a combustion engine. Those components, they wear in how they wear in. It's just kind of what it is. So it's not really a design flaw. It's just internal combustion engine burning gasoline. So I don't know if I would call it a design flaw. It's just kind of how it is. And then also on top of that, the load. So the mapping and the load that's on the engine, which is the big difference on why you see it more in outboards than you see it in cars, because it's a less load. So, no, they're not going to really, there's nothing to really cover, I guess, is what they're going to say. There's nothing that can be done really. Figure out why it's doing that and then try and fix it. Usually you can get those rings to seat. If you get them hot and if it's a carbon problem, whatever it is, you can usually get to stop. On the 3.3 liters, when it was a brand new plasma fused cylinder walls, because of how hard the cylinder walls were, that was kind of a learning experience there. They're still going to say that it's the, appearance of making oil or fuel dilution. But, that's the only one, the shows and stuff like that. Usually the ones that are doing that, as soon as you get the prop right and start running it right, like by and large, most of them, all the problem goes away. So that's, kind of my take on that. Jack Gonzalez, thank you for the comment. I'm going to be paraphrasing this a little bit. He says that my tachometer has never worked, and the one that was on the boat when I bought it actually caught fire. So I replaced, but have never got readings that made sense. My tach jump around like crazy when I start the motor. Once I get going, it either reads 0 or on occasion it will read between 1,000 and 2,000 RPM, regardless where the throttle is. So Jack, tachometer is an analog tachometer. It only reads a pulse signal that comes from the engine. Now, most likely, if you've got a brand new tach in there, as long as, depending on the brand, there are some aftermarket tachs that are kind of like questionable out the box. But as long as you've got, a decent tach, it could, just an analog tach, all it does is take power, ground, and it takes a pulse signal, and that basically gives you the RPM. It's very simple. So as long as you have it hooked up correctly, sounds like you do, because it'll go 0, 1 to 2, so it will change. So that means that the power and the ground are right, but the sense wire, which is reading that pulse from the stator coming in, most likely between the tach, seeing that's a brand new tach, in your engine, most likely that wire somewhere is messed up, because if it was a problem with the engine, you like if it was your stator, your trigger, and all that stuff that was messing up, because that's where it kind of gets that signal. Depending on which engine you have, the engine would be running, it wouldn't be running right, because the tach signal is also used on most models as either the trigger or the crank position sensor. And so if that sensor is messed up, then the engine's going to be messed up as far as like how it's running. It's going to have a running issue. But if you don't have a running issue, then most likely from the engine where that wire comes out to the tach, somewhere that wire's messed up, whether that be in a connection point or it got nicked somewhere or it's got resistance, whatever the situation may be, most likely that wire is messed up somewhere. So I'd be tracing that wire and figuring that out, depending on what engine you have. Fake name says, what's the best way to get boat weight when there's no manufacturing info available, or that I can find? 16-foot aluminum, runabout 1977 Springbok Rocket 3. You go to the weigh station, bro. That's be my first thing to do. That's how I pretty much, you can either go to a marina with a forklift that can weigh it. So like if you're, near somewhere near a marina, you can, if it's on the water and they have a forklift, you can just drive the boat over there. They'll probably charge you whatever they might charge you to pick the boat up out of the water, look at the scale and tell you how much it weighs. Or you can just go to a weigh station. So go to a recycle center, trying to think of what else would be, like you can go to a landfill, a recycle center, a dump, somewhere like that, a weigh station. And depending on the state that you live in, some of them, a lot of them, it's free. So you just go there with your truck and your trailer and the boat, you get your weight, take the boat, get it off the trailer, come back, weigh truck and trailer, and then boom, you'll get your weight difference based on that. Account for how far you driving. Do you have a full tank of fuel? Do you not have a full tank? That kind of deal. But other than that, I go with the weigh station, landfill, recycle center, depending on where you're at in those companies. A lot of them will have maybe even a wrecking center, a junkyard. Some of them might have a scale that you can use. Or some of them might even let you just pull up on there, unhook it, and just weigh the trailer. But also, depending on the state, some of it would be free, but that's going to be what I would do. Steve Stewart says he's got a 2003 250 horsepower HPDI. Is it possible, and do you recommend eliminating oil system and running premix to eliminate that point or failure on an old engine? No. 100%, Steve. No, do not do that. That's a bad idea. That's a HPDI is a high pressure direct injection engine, and the oil system is oiling it before it's putting in oil into your intake, which is lubing the inside of the engine. If you eliminate that and premix, the fuel system goes from the fuel tank into your VST up to a high pressure tank and then to injector rails that are squirted directly into the cylinders. So if you eliminate that oil system, the crank, the bearing, the rods, behind the pistons, all the internals of the engine will get no lubrication. You're going to lock the engine up and you're going to blow it up. So no, do not do that. And we just made a video on this a few weeks ago also about this, because it seems to be a hot topic where people trying to run premix, but rule of thumb, most engines with an injector, I wouldn't premix it. I just run the oil system, with the exception of some of the Mercs that had that plastic rod. That plastic rod ain't the best thing. So on those, that is kind of a situational thing. Carbureted engines, on any of those 30-year-old carbureted engines, yeah, you can do that, except for the Yamahas. I mean, the Yamaha system's pretty bulletproof, but on the VROs and some of those, a lot of those you can eliminate premix, but any direct injection engine, do not do it, because you're not going to lubricate the inside of the engine. You're going to blow it up. Dustin Keating, what's your take on the 07 Yamaha 115 two-stroke? And sometimes I get a little black soot that comes from the lower cowling. The motor runs great. Just wondering, why would the soot come from there? I also get soot from the propeller running down the skeg, but I know that's normal for a two-stroke. I would look around, take that cowling off, because most likely, if it's coming out the cowling, you probably have a spark plug that's not all the way in, and it's pushing out through the spark plug and running down the back, most likely. But you could also have a head problem or something else that could be going on where you're getting soot out. Most likely it's just the spark plug messed up, but take the cowling off and inspect that. Black soot on the skeg, you're running rich for one, but two, soot and oil coming down is usually timing and running rich. But if it's coming out of the cowling, most likely one of your spark plugs is not in all the way, and it is just pushing, the part of the the combustion of fuel and fire and air, part of that, byproduct is just getting pushed out. Check that. Life is fun, eh? Dang, missed it. Question: what is life hours expectancy on F60 4-stroke freshwater use only? Thanks. Talking about missing a live stream. If you guys do like the live streams, I've been trying to do one public per month, and then you could either become a Boaters Program member, which helps fund this entire operation for me to be able to sit here and answer questions like this. But also, we do have on the main channel a member section where you can come every week. We do a live stream, and there's not a lot of people that show up, but it's perfect for more of like a one-on-one situation. So if you want to ask me a question, that's the best way to do it. Otherwise, it's there's going to be a lag between the podcast and when I can actually sit down and answer questions. Just from the time that it takes me to make a lot of the content, I just don't have. But as far as your question goes, life is fun. On an F60 4-stroke freshwater use only, I mean, a long time. 40 years, 50 years, the engine might outlast you. Are you going to need to put some money into it, like a fuel pump or maybe an injector, spark plugs, maintenance items? Probably. But if you take care of that engine, an F60, that thing's going to run for a long time, 40, 50, 60 years. I wouldn't be surprised. In freshwater use, now if you're running it, depends on how much you're running it. If you're putting 1,000 hours on it in a year, then no, it's not going to run that long. But if you're not putting a ton of time on it, then that engine is going to run for a long, long time. Let's do one more question from Garplin. What are some common issues with the new V8 Mercs? They ain't that new no more. Pretty sure they came out like 16, 17, 18, something like that. So they're 6, 8 years old. So coming up on, I want to say it's 16 when they came out. So we're 8 years. We're coming up on a decade. So they ain't that new. But most of the issues that we've seen with those are starter issues. Most of them are wire harness issues. by and large, in the very, very brand new ones, like the early models, there was some shift actuator issues. Those are all pretty much gone. The starter issues, for the most part, those are gone. I mean, that kind of comes and goes. There was a diverter on the cowling where the cowling would be taking in water when it was trimmed up, and it would go down and trip on the starter and they would fail, and they made diverters to divert that water. But that, again, that's early stuff. And then there was, back in COVID, I mean, they've been calling them COVID engines now. Like, for any engine that was built during COVID, regardless of the brand, we've had problems, seen problems with components. There for a while, there was no oil filters for the engines because one of the manufacturers that was manufacturing the oils just said, we're done manufacturing oils, and they had to find a whole new supplier for all the oil filters. So, there was that problem. Other than that, most of the problems are all gone away. Even the wire harnesses, I don't think that they're failing as they were. They've kind of figured that out. They had an FSM problem for a little while, but again, these were like, component problems based on the supplier, based on the components. It wasn't really a V8 engine problem. We don't see V8s blow up that much. So as far as the block and the platform goes, it's a solid platform. I mean, if you look at it, the engine is lightweight, torquey, and built like solid all the way around. That's why you can see that platform is basically the entire Mercury lineup now. From 200 up, like V6, V8, V10, V12, they're all basically the same engine, just with more of them stacked up. So it's a very solid platform, weight-wise, torque-wise, like really good. But common issues, that's mainly what I can think of as far as that. So early years, starters, the FSM issues, the wiring harness issues, shift actuator issues. But again, most of that stuff's all been done away with, except, and it would be batched out between years. So like, this model serial number to this model serial number would have, let's say if it was an FSM problem, this one would have it based on this is the period of time when the FSM builder, the supplier, was messing those up. So that, those are those kind of related things. But I wouldn't say that there's any common issues outside of those that have not been addressed and fixed and, kind of done away with.